So thank you everyone and welcome to our panel, which you'll notice was entitled Sustainable Communities, New Approaches to Integrated Solutions. So we had a call earlier, I want to say this week, and I think I proposed a speaking order. I didn't hear anything to the contrary. So let me just start with a very, very brief introduction of our panelists. And then the idea is to kind of folks to launch in, and then we may have a question or two among ourselves and then open it up. I know time is short. So we're going to start off to the far right with Rich. I was thinking earlier today, we were talking about the unemployment rate of 9.5% and how we could alleviate that. It looks like Rich has 2 jobs with New York City Housing. So if he would just give up one of those jobs, maybe someone else could get a job. But he is the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President for Capital Markets with the New York City Housing Development Corporation. He'll probably talk more about it. One of the things that I saw was quite impressive. If you folks remember back in 2002, when Mayor Bloomberg had launched the new housing marketplace plan, kind of since then, 110,000 units preserved or constructed of affordable housing, and the Housing Development Corporation, I believe, has financed 50,000 of those. So they've been an incredibly strong partner in that. So he's going to talk a bit about how they approach kind of housing and maybe how they start to incorporate some other things. And then following up from Rich, we're going to have Dan Nissenbaum, who's also a Columbia Business School grad. He's the managing director with the Urban Investment Group, and which I believe they would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, they use a double bottom line model to help revitalize inner cities through financing projects that bring needed housing, jobs, education, healthcare, and other services to underserved and emerging communities. Dan's a managing director at the Urban Investment Group. He's also a board chair with the National Housing Conference and the Low Income Investment Fund, which is a major community development financial institution. So he's going to come up second. And then we're going to have Dave Walsh, second to my right. He's the Senior VP for Community Development with JPMorgan Chase, formerly with the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. Before that was with Common Ground, you all may know, a large affordable housing developer in New York City. And then interestingly, before that, kind of helped to identify Kuwaiti capital to invest in real estate here. So I know we're all looking for capital these days to finance projects, so Dave can point us in the direction of Kuwaiti funds. And last but not least, we're going to have Andrea. So Andrea Davila graduated from Columbia Business School last year.
Just in May.
Right. And she has a very cool job with the New York City Housing Authority, with the Department of Resident Economic Empowerment and Sustainability, to create jobs for NYCHA residents as part of kind of the housing project. So I think some of it is Andrea is going to give us kind of her perspective on how to integrate other kinds of things like job creation, job development into housing projects.
And we actually have a job opening.
And look at that.
Look at that.
So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rich. Far right.
Great. Now, should I go up there for
There's a clicker if you want to use that, or do you want to stand up?
Actually, you know what? It might help to stand up for a little bit. Because actually, this picture is a good example. So, I'll speak up. I don't think it's quiet. So, this is a picture of the Bronx. And the reason why we use it is because we've done an enormous amount of work in the Bronx. And the reason why it's sort of relevant to this discussion is to kind of, and obviously it's an aerial shot, so it's not going to give you a close-up. But a lot of this infill over here are new developments that have been financed in the last 10 years. And the investment in the Bronx, we're talking probably in the sort of $3 to $4 billion range of how much has gone towards new affordable housing and preservation of existing affordable housing. But one of the things that's sort of interesting, and I sort of try to put a context as we talk about economic development and sustainable communities, is partly it relates to the lessons that we've learned about affordable housing over time. And then one of the things that we'll talk about that Andrea will go into when she talks a little bit about what NYCHA is trying to do. You'll see towards the left of this, there's this big group of dark brown and then a lighter red-brown group of housing. Those are mostly city housing. And what we were talking about is that city housing was done, a lot of it was built in the 50s. It's towers in the park. And because of a lot of the rules that were in place at the time, there's essentially no commercial space, external commercial space. So there are these big developments, and they sort of create little dead zones, where they are, and the commercial space has to be outside of where people are living. And so one of the things it does is that people then have to walk 4 blocks, 6 blocks, 8 blocks to get to groceries, to get to other services that are relevant to them. And it sort of creates these sort of little zones where there's just not a lot of opportunity. Now, going back, there's probably not a lot of planners here. I have a background in planning as well as law degree. I'm actually the general counsel at HTC, so actually for the rest of the position. Either way, is that Jane Jacobs, the whole idea of being on the street. And the whole towers in the park doesn't create sort of street light that is sort of vital to what we think is what's great about New York. And that's one of the issues that comes up with the public housing. But also the commercial space, the sort of 24-hour nature of commercial that helps create neighborhoods. Whether it's as simple as daycare or as complicated as 24/7 drugstore. Probably not that complicated, but it sounded good when I was thinking about it. That's something that we are trying to change. And so one of the things that we talked about was sort of, as the lead off, is talk about where we started from and where we've gone to. So when I'm talking about the context, it's not just the public housing, but generally the approach towards affordable housing. Even something as simple as the tax rules that allow for affordable housing had exceptions for commercial space. It was actually in many ways discouraged. You couldn't use taxes and bonds, for instance, to finance commercial space. There are all these sort of separations. One of the lessons we've learned is that we need to try to create integrated communities where there's going to be both economic opportunity, also just sort of to create the life of a neighborhood that's necessary, and that you don't have the dead zones that might have been created before. So what we do now is try to have that there's a certain amount of commercial space that's relevant and that hopefully is supportable. Then recognizing that you can't prop a development. Let's say I'm going to show a couple of things that this is about recycle bonds, and it's not relevant today, but we do want to show a couple of pictures of developments. And this is one of the ones that's in the heart of the Bronx section that we were just looking at. And it's a development called St. Anne's, and it has, it's a 3.5 acre site, and it's over 600 units with 45,000 square feet of ground floor commercial space. So if you think about it, if you're doing a development for 600 families, you may have 1,500 to 1,800, even 2,000 people who are going to live, in essence, in sort of one large super block with a lot of different facades. So it looks like there are multiple buildings, but in fact it's sort of all an interconnected complex. But it's important that when you're going to bring that many people to an area, that you don't dump them in and not have some of the things that you're going to want them to, that they need to survive. And so we've become much more aware of that. And recognize that our developments are engines for these communities, and that we need to provide resources for the people who are moving in there. So that, when you're, in essence, creating new communities, you can't just do it blindly and not think about what their needs are going to be. So we try to kind of cobble together a variety of different programs. And as I said, this PowerPoint relates to recycled bonds, and it's a complex bond idea that we just got an award for. And that's why I did the presentation. But it was a way to get more resources available for affordable housing and allowing us to do mixed income communities in a way that was more flexible than what had been done before. So this is one development where we were able to do that. And as I said, bringing other resources into a community, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about. Another development, another picture of it sort of as it was being proposed. And what's fascinating also is that the amount of resources that then get brought in. We like to remind people that our developments are economic and important infusions. And so when the stimulus was going on, there was a certain amount of money made available for affordable housing. And what's interesting also about it is it went out really quickly. And the kind of economic engines that these are is it's initially it's the construction. They're all the people who are working construction. I mean, there's probably nothing better for a deli than to have a construction site opening up across the street. There's a lot of use of that, and it ripples through as you think about it. When you see the people who are coming in every day and they need to find whether something as simple as a sandwich for lunch. And so it's that, but it's also then the continued nature of that, bringing new people into a community, creating other opportunities, jobs and the like, bringing more families in so that daycare is more necessary. It ripples, and that's part of what we're recognizing more so. And as we're devoting so many resources into these communities, that it all kind of comes together. And it's not just seen as we're just doing affordable housing. And because it's affordable, it's got to be cheap and simple, and there shouldn't be anything else. And if they have to walk, too bad. But that it's seen as we're trying to create neighborhoods, create opportunity. This is another site, and this is one that's now in Brooklyn, because we're not just doing work in the Bronx. We're working in all 5 boroughs, including Staten Island, maybe to their chagrin, since they're not necessarily the biggest fans of affordable housing. Anyone from Staten Island? Okay, so this is Brooklyn, but wait, there is something in Staten Island, and you're going to wrap me out? Call the court. Don't call the court.
Rich. So
Yeah.
can you remind us of who financed St. Anne's and who financed the Bradford?
Thank you. Good point. St. Anne's, let me go back to it. I don't know when I'm going forward. St. Anne's, and isn't it pretty? Primary role played by JPMorgan, and Dave will be talking about that a little bit. And JPMorgan is Cap One. So very important to make sure that you show the proper appreciation for your colleagues and partners in business. Well, especially if you haven't graduated yet, learn how to, especially when you're dealing with JPMorgan and Goldman Sachs. That is very much appreciated. Thank you, JPMorgan. Thank you, Goldman Sachs. The Bradford is another development, and this is an even more intriguing one, and I think that Dan will get into this a little bit, because it also had new markets tax credits. And new markets is another tool. I mean, in the housing toolbox, the major tools we have are the low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt bonds, and then the fact that the city, that is both the Department of Housing Preservation as well as HTC, where I am, puts subsidy into deals, to the extent of hundreds of millions of dollars every year of money that's put in as 1% loans. So we're putting that money in, but there are also these other tools that are available. In addition to city land and tax abatements, all these different things because of the importance of affordable housing to New York. For anyone who's still in school, you're probably wondering where you'll be living. Affordable housing is important, and for the whole spectrum of folks. So that there are opportunities. So the Bradford is an interesting use of both recycled bonds as well as new market tax credits. And so the intersection, as I said, Dan will go into a little bit about that. And Goldman played a significant role in buying the new market tax credit equity. And this is just another example of what we do, which is preservation. And this is a classic tower in the park, if ever there was one. It's the largest building in Crown Heights. The tower is about 400 feet, not too far from Eastern Parkway. And it's a Michelama that was originally built in the mid-70s, and then was just refinanced last year by HTC using recycled bonds. The other project that I wanted to mention, and then more about the sustainability issues and how we're looking to try to create, obviously green is good, and trying to do as much of that is a project called Via Verde, the Green Way. You may have seen there was a cover piece in the Times 2 weeks ago. It is really one of the prettiest developments I've ever seen, and it was an important opportunity to try to do both great design as well as a consciousness about environmental issues, unlike any other project we had done. And that comes with a certain expense. But there was a desire to do this and try to create sort of to figure out how we can do this, hopefully create more efficiency, and also create benchmarks. One of the real challenges we have with sustainable development is, often there's an initial expense that is beyond traditional expense. And then we have to come up with ways to rationalize that, and it's been tricky because the appraisers have a hard time saying that if you do this particular, sort of heating system, that you're going to save this kind of money. And we don't have all of that information yet. But clearly, trying to create sustainable communities is not just about creating economic opportunity, but also recognizing the environmental impact that we have in our buildings and trying to reduce that and to make these buildings hopefully more cost efficient going forward, as well as creating a great environment. So there's a lot of different things that we're doing, and sort of to kick off to some of the discussions of other examples that people have to kind of go through that. So as I said, try to bring all these tools in, create affordable housing that's attractive, create sustainable communities, creating opportunities for people in these communities. And one of the interesting facts that we have in our own sort of databases is that HTC's economic activities has created more retail than the city's Economic Development Corporation. And it's sort of I think that's sort of surprising, since that's not our job. We're the Housing Development Corporation, and there's a separate Economic Development Corporation. But it's all in that kind of sense of, sorry, I keep on getting that, of the economic integration that we're looking for. So that's the story about what we're about, and this is HTC's Programs. This is a quick summary that we really do a full spectrum of housing, from low income that's targeted to people who are below 60% area median income, up to about 175% of area median income. So the New York area median income is about 80,000 or so for a family of four. So ranging from $30,000 up to about 140,000. And we've had different kinds of programs to provide housing opportunities, and that's sort of one of the sort of trademarks of the new marketplace housing plan, is creating opportunities that go from very low income up to what we call workforce or middle income housing. So that's a bit about our story. And this is our website if you're interested. There's lots of information about the projects and the like at nychtc.com.
Thanks, Rich. Dan, next up.
Great. Thank you. I think, as you can tell, Rich has a fourth job, and that is as a professor, and he actually does teach. So
I
you
do.
can
So
tell that
at Columbia,
This is
planning school, and affordable housing, public finance.
Which is one of the reasons we asked him to go first, because I think Rich has given you a wonderful sort of landscape and survey about the kinds of projects that are now being financed in the affordable housing industry and the complexity around that. So I want to follow that, although I'm going to be sort of brief, because I think we want to get to conversation, and we know it's sort of standing between you and the rest and the weekend. I think we were asked to think a little bit about challenges in the field and what drives innovation, and again, Rich has touched on a number of these points. I would just say, in addition to some of the things Rich talked about in terms of context, the field of community development has been siloed in many respects, and I think in two of them are primary, which is why we're just now getting to this discussion about talking about how innovative it is to combine residential and other types of retail or commercial uses. One is just from a pure asset perspective. The field has been fairly well divided into those who financed housing, or those who finance small businesses, or those who finance community facilities. I think the second main driver is that in our industry, and as we're trying to reach into low and moderate income communities for mission-driven types of financings, you need subsidy simply to get those financings done, whether you're trying to cap rents at a certain level or serve people at a certain income level. And because those aren't economic in the broadest sense on their face, that's often driven by subsidy, and subsidy to a great extent has not worked well together. You either had HUD financings or you had low-income housing tax credit financings. We're just getting to the place where we're able to combine a lot of those together. There's some downside of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think more broadly then, you are seeing an increasing amount of financing which combines different subsidy sources, which provides both residential and community facilities or other types of development, and I think there are basically 4 drivers there. And again, I'm sorry I'm going quickly, but I want to leave time for others, and we'll leave time for questions. I think one is the needs and desires of communities. I think as more of those projects like towers in the park got developed, everybody began to see the risks around that, the downside, some of the failures of those types of developments. And communities have been advocating, I think, for less segregated, whether it's economic, racial, or any other basis, types of developments, mixed use, mixed income, that type of thing. I think the second thing is that investors and policymakers have begun to realize that increased diversification is both protects their asset and is a better, can only help sustain communities. So in other words, less pure focus on the number of units that have been financed or that building on a standalone basis, and more realization that if you're mixing incomes within a building, or if you're providing, as Rich said, sort of neighborhood serving retail or charter schools that can then support the fact that you just built 300 units in a neighborhood, you are going to create a stronger attraction, retention, and that asset will do better, and the people who live in that asset will have a better path to success. Same thing for jobs, etc. There is an increasing amount of research that's being sponsored by the Federal Reserve that actually is talking more about this concept of healthy communities and getting away from, again, silo-driven development or subsidies that focus only on units and less on outcomes. And there is really now studies that are coming out that show that zip code is destiny, and that is incredibly depressing to think that if you happen to be in a certain area and you don't have the same resources that many of us enjoy, you simply have less chance for success. And there obviously are adverse effects in terms of educational outcomes that create a social cost to society. I think the third driver of creativity and the need for innovation is less subsidy. And as Rich said, the whole concept of recycled bonds in part came from, others can speak to it more eloquently, came from the fact that there's just a cap on the amount of subsidy that's available to a locality, an issuer, or to developers. And so we've all had to be more creative about thinking about how we can combine these subsidy sources, or how we can tap into new subsidy sources. And you're seeing projects that not only involve recycled bonds, but that combine new markets tax credits with low-income housing tax credits, which are taking advantage of different types of tax credit financings, be it solar tax credits, or for instance in New Jersey, urban hub transit tax credits. There's a lot of different things that I think are beginning to show up in these projects. And I think to say the last driver of innovation is really, comes from maybe more subjective or less concrete types of things, including the fact that those of us who are in the business, Chase, Goldman, others, are motivated by a number of factors. In one respect, and in addition to our partners in the city, we all want to be more responsive to the needs of communities, and those needs are evolving. We'd all like to create more impact than what we've seen. Certainly there's evidence of competition, all in good spirit. We do this for brand. We do this also whether we're regulatory pressures in terms of CLA or not. And we have this vast toolkit as our industry has evolved, where it's not just grant financing, but we're moving to mezzanine financing, direct equity financing, tax credit equity, interesting structures around bonds, etc. I would conclude then by saying that on the other side of all of this, there are a significant amount of challenges that we face. First, combining this is no picnic. And if you saw the structure chart for the Bradford, I think your head would explode. For relatively small sized projects, we're not financing 1,000 units in many cases. Bradford was a smaller number of units, though it was a $50 million deal, but it had 4 different components. Combining these requires an army of lawyers and accountants, and those things have a cost and limit the amount to which we can scale this. But job creation, but for the wrong kind of people. I gave you a 4th job, literally. I'd say there's another side of this which I don't have a more elegant term for other than it's called mission pile-on, which means great to create units. Great to create units that might have other types of community facilities embedded in them. Great to create green. All of those things are terrific, but all of those things make scopes more expensive, and I think as Rich touched on briefly, we haven't yet hit the point where it's a clear path to seeing some of those economies realized. So if you're adding a lot of things onto a development, those things add complexity, time, and cost. In the broadest, and I think that leads to the next issue, which is a challenge, which is that we're here talking about fairly specialized types of financing, and I think unless we, particularly in the context of having the GSEs go away, unless we can create financings that attract a broader set of investors rather than just CRA-motivated investors or socially motivated investors, the impact and the scale of our impact will be fairly limited, and I think that's a really important challenge for what we do and how successful we be going forward. It's an obvious statement to say that given the deficit reduction initiatives that are ongoing in Washington and the impact on state and local governments, all of this being said, we're just going to have to be try even harder to be innovative and to try to do more with less.
Thanks, Dan. Great. Yeah.
Good afternoon. As Rich mentioned, Vita Verde is a unique project. I only brought a handful of pictures and wanted to move through this pretty quickly if possible, but this is really one of the most unique developments that I think has been done in a long time, if ever. I mean, from an affordable housing perspective. It brings to bear pretty much everything that Rich and Dan were talking about, what's important to a community, and sort of bringing it together. The building itself is 150 units on an 18-story tower of rental with 71 affordable co-ops connected. This is a picture just of the facade with the solar shades. But its most unique aspect of the entire building is really the greening of the building. What it has, effectively, is 40,000 square feet of green. There's gardens that the tenants are able to grow their own vegetables. It goes to the healthy living concept. That's on site. There's fruit trees that will be available. The building was designed in such a way that any vertical plane on the building has a solar panel. There's over 300 on the building itself. And what that's doing is they actually tie the power generated by the solar panels into the elevator system. The internal design of the building has stairways that encourage you to walk, so it goes towards, again, the healthy living concept. On-site, Montefiore Hospital is the lessee in the commercial space, so you have on-site medical space as well. The site itself was, the building design as a whole was designed from a community perspective, so you have a common area on the inside of the building. So you can see you've got the affordable co-ops for sale, and those co-ops are for sale for individuals that earn anywhere from 70 to 100% of AMI from the area. The rental building, which is for 60% of AMI, that was a full tax credit type transaction that was done on that. But it really creates a sense of community, and this is right smack in the middle of where Rich had pointed out, the Melrose section of the Bronx, which has really gone through a real rejuvenation. There is a tremendous amount of development that has gone into that area. It's got great access to the subways. And frankly, in my opinion, it's really empowered the area and the people that live in the general area to sort of feel better about where they're living. We have JPMorgan's role was in partnership with HTC, Rich's agency, where they issued the bonds. We provided a letter of credit on the transaction, as well as we're the investor into the tax credits. This is one of the most unique examples of affordable housing that pretty much has ever been done. I mean, and I'm talking about probably in the country. The developers on the project were Jonathan Rose companies and the Phipps companies. Jonathan Rose is pretty well known. He's one of the leading green type of developers in the country. Phipps Houses, based here locally. It's been around a long time. We're about 6,000 units now. A terrific nonprofit, also very mission-driven type social service organization. Does fantastic work. So you had a terrific nonprofit partnering with perhaps one of the leading, if not the best, green developers in the country to come together. They actually won a design competition with this design, and they were chosen over 32 other applications for this site. The site was city-owned. The site was contributed to the project itself, and I think the total development cost was close to $90 million in aggregate. $60 million for the rental and about $30 million for the co-ops. But it is really helping to transform the general area. The reason we wanted to sort of talk a little bit about this is, I was thinking about this coming up before, is what is sort of JPMorgan's interest or role in trying to help, you know, these types of developments get off the ground. We're really becoming more on the community development side of the bank, really mission driven. We're looking for economic development opportunities around the country and to really invest in into the markets that we serve. We've, over the last couple of years, even during the economic slowdown, continued at the same level we had been doing from a tax credit investment perspective, which is roughly $700 to $800 million per year, as well as on our new market tax credit side, which was investing, I think it's invested to date about $2.5 billion since the program came into play, as well as on the debt side, which is I'm on. We typically finance, on a construction lending perspective, over $1 billion a year, only in affordable housing transactions. So we're pretty committed to doing it. Goldman Sachs, and I know Dan is over there, they do a terrific job as well. They're a terrific partner. There's a lot of deals that get done like this where a bank like Goldman Sachs is on the tax credit equity side, and we're on the debt side, and sometimes vice versa. So it's a real partnership. Some of the big challenges we see going forward, Dan touched on the subsidy issue. It is forcing us, because the states and cities can no longer afford to be putting in the types of subsidy that had been put on, which were pretty good, to sort of look at the models that we traditionally used and come up with new models and think about ways that we're going to continue at the pace we've been on. I know since I worked at New York State, we would typically look to do 3,000 to 4,000 units a year and affordable in the entire state of New York. That's going to be a tough pace to keep up with because we simply don't have the resources or had the resources to do it. So how do we do things differently? There are lots of different models that are being kicked around. Recycle bonds is one of them. New market tax credits now are being used on housing projects. That's another model that's being used. And frankly, one of the biggest things that folks are starting to face is the fact that it's a partnership. And if we all want these projects done, then everybody's going to have to share in the pain to get them done. And that means you might even start seeing real developer equity start showing up in some of these transactions. Not sure if that will happen, but that's where I see it sort of heading. But in this particular case, you had probably 7 or 8 different agency-type financings that were put into this. HTC provided 2 of the financing pieces that were necessary. I think HPD provided maybe 3 or 4 different pieces. The Federal Home Loan Bank was involved. New York State's NYSERDA was involved. New York State's Affordable Housing Corporation was involved for subsidies on the co-ops. So it was a real, and JPMorgan was, from the equity perspective, was there as well. So it was a real smorgasbord of groups that was involved here, and these deals are not very easy to put together. But I do think, there are some really smart folks that are out there looking to, continue the path that we've been on. The city's been just tearing it up for the last 10 years. I mean, they really have done a great job. Actually, somebody who borrowed money from Rich when I worked at Common Ground, I was able to sort of see how they worked and how mission-driven that they were. And I do think that we will come up with some new ideas for financing as we go forward. But it's gonna be some bumps here, I think, in the short term to continue on the pace that we've been going. But for the most part, if you have a chance to go out and visit this site, I know there's one picture that we have. This is the last picture that we had internally at JPMorgan Chase. The panels are up. It looks a heck of a lot better than that, I can tell you right now. The solar panels are actually up, and actually, the solar panels are all along these vertical walls right here. it's pretty amazing to see, so I would encourage everybody to go up and take a look. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. So I'm Andrea. That was really interesting, and I think I'm going to pivot a little bit. I think that looking toward the future, there's all these really interesting ideas about financing and how do we really build community in new affordable housing developments. But I want to talk about what we do with those big blocks up in the Bronx that Rich was showing earlier, and that's where I come in. I work for NYCHA, which is the New York City Housing Authority, and what we have done in the past is just basically build those huge super blocks that have, I think the population of NYCHA residents is the same as the cities of Miami, Atlanta, and Sacramento, which is crazy separately. It's about 500,000 people, which is fascinating. So you think about this 500,000 people population and the fact that they're pretty isolated in these super blocks. So how does NYCHA as the housing authority play a part in the community and actually help the community to grow and to become sustainable? Thus far, NYCHA hasn't really been an active player, but the new chairman, Chairman Ria, who incidentally I think is the first NYCHA chairman with an MBA, which is exciting, just came aboard in 2009, and he really wanted to institutionalize this idea of economic opportunity for the NYCHA residents. So part of this is releasing this plan to preserve public housing and a new push to increase resident economic empowerment and sustainability, which is where my division comes in. So the idea is that currently NYCHA residents are isolated from their communities and isolated from retail spaces. And how do we connect them to employment, asset development, job training, education services in a way that feels sustainable and very localized, because studies have shown that NYCHA residents don't really travel very much. So we're really building on top of the current NYCHA assets and layering on a new approach where we're partnering with outside organizations to help us bring these assets to the NYCHA community. So asking credit unions that are development credit unions in the neighborhood to have special accounts for NYCHA residents, bringing in new financial instruments, I think the social impact bond idea, to figure out how do we get private investment to come in and help us subsidize building new innovations for public housing residents who are going into rental arrears. How do we make an intervention with the people who are rent delinquent at the moment that really matters, figure out what works, and then scale it up to all the NYCHA residents. So we're really working on a whole host of projects, and it's a really innovative time, and there's this idea that we're going to be the new NYCHA. Whether or not it actually happens is still to be decided, but there's a lot of thinking going on right now internally about how to move from this very isolated public housing development to really integrating these ideas of what it means to be a sustainable community into public housing. So it's really exciting, and actually Goldman Sachs funded one of our Jobs Plus sites up at Jefferson Houses. If you don't know about Jobs Plus, it's a new, basically employment pipeline, taking people who are employed and NYCHA residents. I think there's 80,000 NYCHA residents who are of working age who are unemployed, which is a huge population. And Jobs Plus is a research-tested model that allows for residents to come get not only job training, but also some financial incentives to going to work. Currently, if you're a resident of public housing, you pay 30% of your income toward your rent. So if you work more, then all of a sudden you have to pay more toward rent. It's a disincentive toward working. So figuring out how to build in new incentives toward working, having that being held in an escrow account that you get at the end of your time in the program is a way to incentivize residents to work. And then actually following the residents through, having the actual space in their development to connect them to job opportunities. And there's been I think it was 16% increase in their earnings sustained after 7 years. So it's been a really interesting pilot, and we're trying to expand it. We've expanded it to 3 developments now, and we're trying to expand it to even more. So we're really trying to pilot and innovate on what we can do with the assets that we do have.
Thank you, Andrea. So I thought I would ask one question to the panelists, and then what time can we go until? Are we allowed to? Hmm?
Like quarter of 10.
Okay, so we've got about 15 or so minutes. I thought, Dan, it was a really nice recap of kind of the innovation and the challenges. And so I guess I was thinking a bit about this idea of, that idea of organizations kind of working your lane versus the idea of trying to embrace this sort of more comprehensive approach. And just where I come from is kind of from a nonprofit developer model where, we'll do charter schools, but then, you think about mixed use, and you'd like to do housing, maybe we want it to be green, maybe we want to do solar panels, but we can't afford them, so there's something out there called the power purchase agreement where someone else owns it, puts solar panels on your roof, and you can buy that electricity. And again, that all adds sort of cost and complexity and time. So what do you guys think about, do we need sort of the owner and developer to embrace that more expansive mission? Or is this really about kind of putting together the right parties and everybody sort of works their lane? And granted, now you need everyone to work in concert. And so that was kind of the first part of the question, is how do we get there if we really want to change and how this works and that it isn't so siloed? And then based on how you think it should happen, what would you recommend if you had a magic wand and if you could make one or two things different about the world of affordable housing and community development? What would be your one or two wishes for changing the way that it works now to make this idea of more integrated developments happen? So I don't know who wants to think more. Who's got an answer right now? Rich?
Well, I mean, as far as how do you kind of bring people together, I think programmatic ways are often the best way. Mm-hmm. So creating program goals is clearly a way to have people sort of try to think through problems, and having incentives as part of that is a way to do that. So the variety of different tools that we've used to do that. I mean, some of the incentives are as simple as incentivizing affordable housing. Whether we've done that with zoning and we've done that with other and making available certain financial tools. But we've started doing the same things when it comes to sort of the other sustainable issues that we've been talking about today. So recognizing certain things so that community space is given a bonus, and I think government has an important role. And not surprising, I'm coming from government, so I'm going to think there's some rationale for my being. But I think that we can lead the way towards some of that. And then I want to think about what would I change. But I think we have on some level because we're putting in so much of the resources, and we have the ability to sort of manipulate the other resources, that I think that we often can take the lead. And I think we've moved in those directions, and that's part of what's the idea, I guess, behind the whole panel, was sort of how we moved away from the 50s to the 70s style to something that's much more current, and really is looking at things much more holistically than had been done. And so I think we can continue those lessons, and then to have the kind of feedback from the different participants to sort of kind of cut through the challenges, because it's hard. Right. And you pointed out the siloed nature of things. By their nature, that will make things hard. But if we come up with ways to incentivize, and some of the incentives don't necessarily have to cost more money, but allow for more opportunity.
Yeah, to that point, NYCHA really is attempting to move away from a direct service model with the residents. Previously, NYCHA had multiple staff members who would work with residents on job training, job placement, adult education, and actually toward a more partnership approach. And the way we figured out how to incentivize our partners to partner with us, because we're not giving them any money, is to use our assets and really figuring out what the NYCHA asset inventory is, and saying, we have some, not a lot, but commercial space in our developments. Is that something that we can give to, for example, Harlem Children's Zone is building a charter school in a NYCHA development, which is a huge, difference from the way that developments have functioned in the past. It's more isolated, and actually integrating the city and asking them to build a lane through the development, open up a street so that people can get to and from the school, and actually using that space. And now Harlem Children's Zone is willing to say, not only will we build a school on your space, but we'll actually give jobs to your residents at the school. So figuring out what is the right incentives in that partnership is a little tricky, but once you get it right, it can be really fruitful.
And actually, another partnership, and we've partnered a lot with NYCHA, partly because of the excess land. So some of the developments that we've done, there's a certain amount of money that goes to NYCHA, but some of it is also creating opportunity for folks who live in NYCHA housing, also people who are overhoused, that is, who may be in bigger units, or who may be higher income, who may want to move into some of the new housing that's being built and creating places for the folks from NYCHA housing. So there are a variety of different opportunities. There's been a lot of partnering because one of the assets that NYCHA does have is land. All those towers in the park did not fully utilize the full zoning envelopes that for which they were built. So there's opportunity for that as well.
I think, from a change, the process sometimes for a developer with a concept to make it reality can be a challenge. This is the affordable housing business is a real challenge as far as putting the pieces together to make the model work. And I think, in the case of the different types of tax credits that you can apply for, in the case of, doing a deal with HTC, for example, their process is pretty much rolling. They'll do an issue, I think, twice a year, pretty much. But sometimes, they will do something, that's a little bit different. If you want to do a 9% tax credit deal, you have to apply for them and then typically wait 5 to 6 months before you hear whether or not your project was selected. And in a lot of cases, you're not. And then you have to wait to reapply to the following year. Now, there's steps being taken right now to change that. I think within from a state perspective, but I think that's one piece that if you could change that and also make it a lot easier for the developers, instead of having to apply to 4 or 5 different agencies for funding for individual projects, if there could be a single type of application for a city or state project, I think it would make things happen a little bit more quickly. As far as models are concerned, we're starting to see, I'm sure Dan, you're probably being approached on this as we are. You're starting to see more charter schools, type hybrid deals with housing. There are a lot of developers that really have come to us, and I'm sure gone to Goldman to sort of learn a little bit more about how these things are getting financed. They have sites, they want to do a little bit more in the community. So it's an interest. It's sort of evolving here as we go forward, but it should be interesting.
I think we should take questions.
All right.
Yep.
So let's go. In terms of mixed-use buildings with the commercial space, maybe at the bottom of the unit, what's the criteria or the parameters for selecting what business goes into the commercial space?
Usually that's a decision made by the developer. It depends on the actual original zoning. If it was a community space, then it may need to be like either daycare, school related, or health care related. So it depends on what they were using. But generally, the developer is going to look for a mix of services. We play a role in our deals, sort of wanting to encourage, for instance, that really big development that I mentioned earlier. We wanted to make sure that there was something that was going to have that would provide some groceries. So we pushed that very hard because it was an area that was under retail, and we wanted to make sure that they had that. But generally, a developer is going to look out and try to come up with, sort of see what's out there, and we don't get too specific.
I think that's right. I would just add quickly that in the case of new markets, although this is the extreme, there are some businesses that new markets will not, that new markets financing cannot finance, although that has to do more with gambling and illicit type of activities.
And liquor stores, and that just seems wrong.
But that's a whole other panel. I would also say that there are a lot of things that new markets tax credit facilitate. So to Rich's point about bringing in daycare and other types of things that the normal commercial market would not support, because new markets tax credit brings in equity to help finance these commercial facilities. Therefore, developers can bring in tenants they wouldn't ordinarily be able to, rather than a bank, kiosk, with all due respect to us bank branches, or a pharmacy or a grocery store, although those are important. You want to attract more community-oriented facilities, and the markets can subsidize those rents because it's equity financing. It doesn't require a cash pay return. The last thing I would say is, depending on the project or the program or the subsidy, more and more you're seeing some RFPs that would have sort of a set aside or extra points if you're bringing in a certain kind of retail. But otherwise, to Rich's point, it's what the market will bear and the developer can attract.
It seems that over the last quarter century, we've been relearning the lessons of Jane Jacobs and Kenneth Jackson and others in terms of how to integrate housing with the commercial activity. As we stand now and we look at the genuine inflection point of how we use retail and commercial spaces in the future, how is that changing your model of this mixed income housing? Is that perhaps changing the mix of commercial to maybe artisanal, light industrial spaces to residential? Are there some kind of new partnerships emerging, perhaps with hostels, that can also coexist with housing? Or is there something else that is changing the model for the future?
I think, what we've described is some of the changes that we have been able to implement already. What you're asking for is sort of, some interesting thoughts, and part of that kind of gets into this sort of area where I started explaining how not all the rules support a lot of commercial integrated into this concept. So to use it as an example, for us, we're a housing agency. That's what we finance. And so I can't just finance as much commercial as I'd like to. It's not what I'm supposed to be doing. So it makes things more complicated the more you sort of layer on. And so there are different tests that we use for what is eligible for our financing. So in the end, the different thoughts, I think we are looking for more opportunity. We did a development where we actually underwrote a urban farm in Brooklyn as part of, because the rooftop farm is a new thing, and so there's actually income that is expected to come from the farm that will then support the housing. So we are moving beyond that sort of just, a simple drugstore downstairs or a dry cleaner or a laundromat, and that's it. We are trying to evolve and move forward, but it really will depend, and we just keep on shifting it as we're moving around. And we're trying to make things flexible to be responsive. But what's hard is when you're doing a 30 or 35-year loan, if you're ultra trendy, it's kind of tricky because what's to say that which you decided that you're putting your eggs in that basket and taste changes dramatically, and so but it's really a balancing. Everything about this is definitely about trying to balance it.
All right, I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. Let me sort of try to take
Just take them all?
All right, I guess we're not going anywhere. So you in the back, sir, and then you in the blue tie, and then you in the brown tie. So.
Great. Hi, my name is Donnell Baird. I'm a first year here at CBS. I was wondering, full disclosure, I used to be a community organizer for Common Ground in Brownsville, which has 16 separate NYCHA projects within 1 square mile. They're all terrible. What are the ways that you guys are thinking about, and I know you referenced this, Ms. Davila, using the underlying kind of assets of NYCHA, the buildings themselves, as an engine of kind of economic development. So whether through, environmentally efficient retrofits of those buildings or providing broadband to residents. And then on the financing side, what are some of the challenges you guys see in financing the kind of renovation of NYCHA assets? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for full disclosure too, I actually was on rent collection in East Harlem yesterday, so I have full understanding of how much in need some NYCHA buildings are in maintenance. So that was an interesting process. I think that, I mean, as we know, NYCHA has a huge structural deficit. I think it's $125 million right now for maintenance and renovation. The housing stock is old. It will just get older. It is difficult to incentivize residents to not be rent delinquent when their apartments are in oftentimes disrepair and they have a long waiting list. What we're trying to do, you know, in concert with that, unfortunately, there's, you know, we're not so unbureaucratic that we have figured out how to actually talk to one another internally about that. But what we have figured out how to do is use the physical space that we have in NYCHA to bring in certain innovative programs. So this Harlem Children's Zone charter school is one example. There's actually in, I think Jefferson houses also, there's this family investment center where there's actually a space where people can go in the development itself and learn about financial literacy, different asset development products like savings accounts, and again, this idea where you can actually have your increase in rent being held in an escrow account if you're working, and job training program. So one of the neat things that we're doing and using NYCHA assets for is this, it's called the NYCHA Resident Training Academy, and we've partnered with a number of different nonprofits. I think Brooklyn Workforce Innovations, Non-Traditional Employment for Women, and actually bring NYCHA residents into those organizations. We provide sort of the referral pipeline of NYCHA residents to these nonprofits that are place-based in the community, give them a space in the housing development and say, you know how to do this best. We are not experts in teaching people how to, you know, do construction or do janitorial work. You've done this. Why don't we partner with you, bring you into our space so that residents don't have to travel, get you the residents, and let you figure out how to train them and get them job ready. And then on the back end, through a HUD program called Section 3, we actually can also provide jobs in NYCHA housing. So the HUD program requires any housing authority that takes HUD money to put aside a percentage of the work that needs to be done in maintaining the buildings and caretaking of the buildings for residents. So we're actually able to bring both the residents and the jobs, and then contract with a provider in the space to say, why don't you do this part that you know how to do best? And that's the innovation that we're trying to pilot here.
And just on the finance side, we have been working very closely with NYCHA. We did 2 significant transactions in the last 5 years, one a cap fund deal and one a large tax credit transaction that brought over $500 million in funds to work towards the repair issues. And there are on the drawing board several other transactions that will bring up to $750 million of more money to continue the repair issues at NYCHA. So there are a lot of efforts in place to try to bring the resources that are necessary for NYCHA. It's just really hard, but we're working on it.
For those of us who aren't from New York City or the area, don't work here, don't live here, etc., can you give us a range on what you mean by affordable housing for a 1-bedroom apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment?
Affordable is for a 1-bedroom would probably be about $800 a month, and a 2-bedroom is between 10 and 11, $1,000 and 1,100 is what is but it goes up, as I explained earlier with mixed income. We have programs which 2-bedrooms are going for in excess of $2,000, $2,500 for developments in Harlem. And parts of Brooklyn, Long Island City, where the rents are higher, and we really are running a full spectrum of rents because and the students will find this out that New York is an expensive city, and it's not and we have to provide housing opportunity really across the spectrum.
Right, and so I think there's tensions in all of that. So from a public policy perspective, it's sort of fascinating to sit here and listen to ourselves. We're talking about highly complex structured financings to get to, as Rich says, a band of incomes. Yet we have the NYCHA here, which is supporting obviously low-income New Yorkers, which has this huge structural deficit. So when the city awards tax-exempt bond financings or low-income housing tax credits, where should we be allocating those dollars? Is it new construction? or is it preservation? Is it working families, or is it low income? Those are difficult choices. There's obviously no one answer, but those are kinds of the issues that I think we all wrestle with.
And just to clarify, NYCHA actually population is 50% of NYCHA population is below the poverty line, but 50%, and this is one of those Venn diagrams, is also working. So the majority of the population in NYCHA are working. They're just not making very much.
This is, I guess, sort of a pseudo-simple question. Keep mentioning this lady named Jane.
Jane Jacobs.
Yeah. Before her, there were people who wrote books about the evils of the city, and those books and that thinking led to Tower of the Mark and so on. And then Jane Jacobs comes along and writes the book about the evils of the Tower of the Mark. Has anyone gone back and written the third book, which looks at what was wrong with the original accidental model in the first place through a Robert Moses plus Jane Jacobs lens? And crazy question, I know. Is there a third book in the offing that says why not just let people develop the city one brownstone at a time, so to speak?
That's Houston. No zoning. I'm not sure I'm going to give you the best answer to that question. I think the debate right now is probably more broadly around suburban versus urban in terms of evils or lack of efficiencies. I think what everybody's recognized in the broadest sense is that where most of federal resources and others have gone is in building highways and supporting the mortgage interest tax deduction. And that has created sort of isolated communities, contributed to sprawl, contributed to climate change, and created inefficiencies between people who need access to housing and where jobs are located. So I know you're raising a more specific question about the city, but I think the real debate right now is how we shift back more globally than domestically. You're seeing a real refocus on the urban communities, and I think a big issue right now, particularly in the context of the foreclosure crisis, is you have thousands and thousands and thousands of empty homes all over the place. And in the city, you clearly have people who live here and need a place to live, but there's not a lot of land. It's high-cost areas. It's a real challenge. I think that's a fascinating debate that would be interesting to see how that plays out. And the administration just came out with a broad-based request for expressions of ideas, meaning help us, we have no idea what to do, about a rent-to-own, or just a rental strategy, or even a rent-to-own strategy as it pertains to abandoned homes. Cleveland has 15,000 vacant homes. New Orleans has 50,000 vacant single-family properties. That's Katrina plus BP plus foreclosure or subprime. So I think that's where the real debate needs to happen at the moment.
I know there's a session that starts at 5 o'clock, which I think is just a few minutes from now. So I think we'll stick around. If you all have questions and want to come up and approach us individually, you're welcome to do so. I'd like to thank the panelists for making themselves available.